When the Torah in this week's parasha describes the 4 species that we're supposed to use on Sukkot, there's something unusual about how it describes the arava, which in turn teaches us a profound lesson in terms of how we're supposed to understand and relate to our fellow Jews, especially those who don't seem to be so engaged with their Judaism. When the Torah describes the 4 species that we're supposed to take on the first day of Sukkot, it says, Preetz Hadar, which is the Esrog, Kapis Tmorim, which is the Lulav, V'anafei Tzavos, and the Hadasim V'armei Nochal. So Matzinu Davar Pele, and we find something which is very unusual. When the Torah identifies the first 3 of the species, the description that is used for each of those species is something that if it's missing, the species is not suited for the mitzvah. Something related to the actual physical species that you use for the mitzvah. So let's look at the examples. Preetz Hadar, we're told that the esrog is supposed to be a beautiful fruit, meaning the first thing is that the esrog has to be the fruit of a tree. That's fairly obvious. But Hadar has to be beautiful, for which reason practically the esrog hayovesh pasul. If the esrog has started to dry up, it is no longer kosher. So the description of the Torah affects the specifics of what we use for the mitzvah. Likewise, kapis tmorim, the way that the lulav is described is as the close leaves of a date palm. The Alter Rebbe describes what that means is that it's the kind of leaves of the lulav that are close together, and you can actually kind of wrap them all up together with the esrog. If it's started to spread out, it's no longer kosher lulav. Just another issue to focus on over here is when we describe what a lulav is, it has to be from a date palm. The Rogatchover points out the Torah is saying it's not good enough just to take a lulav from a tree that has the name date palm as opposed to other palms that do not produce dates. But the Rogatchover says the Torah is telling us we have to take a lulav from a date palm that actually produces dates. And using that, the Rogatchover explains what the Gemara tells us, that out of the 4 species of the lulav, only 2 of them produce fruit. Because if you think about it, there's these tiny berries that do sometimes grow on the hadassim, so surely it's 3 out of the species that produce fruits. So the Rogatchover explains that the Torah wants us to know it's not good enough that the lulav comes from a species of tree that could potentially produce dates. It actually has to produce dates. And if a person originally planted that tree, that particular palm, so as to use it for wood and not for fruit, it would be disqualified as a tree for a lulav. Whereas we have no consideration that the hadas has to come from a tree that is also producing those little berries. Okay, so the description of the lulav that is relevant is the nature of its leaves and that it has to come from a tree that actually produces dates. Likewise, anafei tzavos, the description of the thick, so to speak, bunching up of leaves of the hadasim imply that hadas chayv liyos avos, which is tlosa b'chad kina. The Gemara tells us avos means that there are 3 leaves coming out of each node on the twig. V'im lav pasul, without that, it would not be kosher. So the 3 first species, the Torah tells us information that is relevant to the specific species you're actually going to use on Sukkot itself. But when it comes to the 4th, which is the Aravis, yes, the Torah does tell us that it has to be Arvei Nachal, which implies that it is the willows that grow by a river. Nevertheless, the practical halach is that is to show balach kshera, that if the Aravis are growing in a place that is not by a river and is not fully irrigated, it's still kosher. Which implies that if the aravis are from the kind of species that usually grows alongside a river, it's 100% kosher, even if it's not currently growing by a river, even if it's not growing where you would have expected it to. So we have to understand then, why are the aravis different to the other 3 species? that it's the only one where the Torah gives us an indication of which species it is in a very generalized fashion, rather than describing what you actually have to physically hold in your hand on Sukkot, as we've done with the esrog that has got to be beautiful, and the lulav that it has to come from a date palm and has to be closed, and the hadassim have to have three little leaves from every node. So there is an opinion of the Gemara that says that the reason why the Torah is willing to accept arobos that don't grow at a river, but rather elsewhere, even in a desert, on the mountains, is Yalfinim Lashon HaKosav Arvei Nachal. It's because it's the only one that the Torah refers to in the plural, Arvei L'Shein Rabbim. And that is the Rabbi Sarava Sheinu Gedele B'Nachal, and that comes to include even arobos that are not growing next to a river, because the Torah has expanded the scope of what is considered to be an arova. But that doesn't actually answer our question. We still need to understand. How come it is that in the other three cases, the Torah wanted us to be able to identify something about the species that you would see in the physical item you're going to carry on the day of Sukkot? And yet, when it comes to arobos, there isn't that same expectation, as long as it falls into the general genus of arobos. But besides that, there's something else that doesn't seem to make sense. Because the way that the Rambam says it, at least according to how most people understand the Rambam, likewise in the Shulchan Aruch, you actually don't need any special wording in the Torah to tell us that all these various kinds of arobos are all kosher, even if they're not located next to a river, because it's actually implied in the basic understanding of the pasuk, which says, why is the arava that is identified for Sukkot called the willow of the river? Because generally that's where you find this willow. But if it's from the same species, but it happens to be in the wrong location, well, there's no reason to exclude anything because it's not in the location that you would have expected it. And the Mefarshim say the Rambam is not deriving that from the fact that Arve is a plural word. Because the Rambam actually uses the plural word to tell us that you have to have two Aravos as part of the Dalet Minim. So if it's two Aravos, you can't use the same word to say, and it also means various species of Aravos, or various locations of where the Aravos come out from. So therefore we're back to square one, which is at least according to the view of the Rambam. When it says Arvei Nachal, it's telling us which species of willow we're supposed to use, rather than a description of what the actual arava that you're holding in your hand on Sukkot is supposed to look like, or where it's supposed to come from, from next to a river. And therefore that only solidifies our question, why would you make such a stark distinction between the first three species that have to have these very specific elements to them and the arava which does not? Says the Rebbe, sometimes you cannot understand things just by looking at Nigla. You need to bring in at least Drash and maybe even Chassidus to understand it. We've explained multiple times that there are various topics within Torah that if you're sticking with just the Pshat, or even if you're looking from the perspective of Nigla, you're not going to have clarity. And the only way you come to understand properly what the Torah is trying to say is Rak only v'dafka, and specifically hadrash v'haremes v'hasoid. You've got to go into the deeper interpretations of the Torah. And particularly Chassidus is really going to help us understand what's going on. And that's exactly what's happening over here. This principle is alluded to in the language of Rashi, v'loshen Rashi v'hadgosha. Ein hamikra hazeh oimer ela darsheni. There are times where the Rashi says, the nature of the pasuk is telling me that I have to look deeper than the pshat of the pasuk in order to understand it. That's the case over here too. To understand why the arava is so different to the other three species is going to depend on how we understand something which we know very well, which is the midrashic perspective on what these four species represent. Once we understand that, everything else falls into place. Isam Medrash, very famous Medrash, that the four species of Sukkos are metaphoric of the four categories of Jewish people that you get. The esrog that has both a beautiful fragrance and taste, corresponds to the Jew who is filled with both Torah and good deeds. The lulav, which comes from the date palm that has a delicious taste but no real fragrance, is that represents people who excel in Torah study way more than in Maisim Tovim. And Hadas, the Hadassim, which are beautifully fragrant but have absolutely no taste, is They represent the people who excel in the world of Maisim Tovim but don't have a tremendous amount of depth in their Torah knowledge. Famously, the harava that lacks both smell and taste, is the Jew who appears to be completely void of any real Jewish content. No Torah and no real Maisim Tovim. So why do we bring them all together? So bring them all together to make a bracha over them is to tell us, the message is that all the various diverse elements of the Jewish community should all come together in a single unity. That's the message. So immediately you can identify that there's a fundamental difference between the nature of the Esrog, Lulav, and Hadassim versus the Arava. Why? Because the first three categories of Jewish people represented by the first three minim, they have a common denominator, which allows them, therefore, a unique kind of bond between them. What's their common denominator? It's the fact that you can clearly identify what their particular assets and values are. They're advantages that you can see, that you can detect. Oh, that's a Torah scholar. Oh, that's somebody, an all-rounder. Oh, that's a person who's excelling in Maisim Tovim. As the famous expression that we use, if you don't call a person a ganav because they know the art of theft, but you call a person a ganav because they've stolen. In the same way as you don't call a person a scholar because they know how to learn, you call them a scholar because they do learn. Likewise, you cannot say that a person is a Baal Maisim Tovim unless obviously they are doing Maisim Tovim. Therefore, the person represented by the Esrog, by the Lulav, by the Hadas, we can see their milas. You can see this is a scholar. You can see that this is a person of excellent Maisim Tovim. You can see that this is a person who has mastered both areas. There's nothing to see with Arava. These are Jews who don't express any spectacular greatness in Torah or Maisim Tovim. So what connects them to the Jewish people? The only reason that you would unite with these people is because I Jew, you Jew. They're Jewish people. That's why we connect to them. It's because of the essence and the core identity of who they are, which is something passed down through the course of history from our forefathers. So even when they are lacking in Torah knowledge and in deeds, and even the person who has grown up their entire life assimilated into the non-Jewish world and has no clue what it is to be Jewish, fact is that is their core identity, and therefore we connect with it in the deepest way possible. Because of that distinction between these different kinds of people, that reflects in the halacha of how you identify the various species that are supposed to represent them. The first three categories of people where you could see the scholarship, you could see the dedication to mitzvahs, you could see their greatness, reflect in species of the Lulav and Esrog, where you could see the specific, oh, this is a beautiful fruit. This is from a date palm. This is a specific kind of growth of the leaves out of the twigs. Whereas the Arava, which represents a person there's nothing to see. So you could have an Arava that didn't grow where it was supposed to grow. Aravas belong at a river. This Arava didn't grow at a river. That's like the Tinuk Shinish V'Lebei Noakum. That's like a Jewish person who grew up assimilated into the non-Jewish world, completely unaware of their Jewish identity. In a cave in Shema, you say Hamin de Arvei Nochal. The most important thing is belongs to the species, belongs to the group of Aravas. This is somebody carries the DNA of our forefathers. That is a kosher Arava, you can use them. And then you will take that Arava and you will bind it up together with the other three species. And only then can you do the mitzvah of the Dalaminim. You cannot do it without the Arava. And not only is it this conceptual idea that here you've got this bland Arava that is being bound up with the others and very much part of the Achdus, The name Arava actually speaks to what Arava is. The word Arava is the same, just with different voweling, to the word Va'arva that the Prophet Malachi says. Pleasant is something which gives the Eibishter nachas, which is beautiful to the Eibishter. Which carries a very clear lesson for us. We have to know first and foremost, first and foremost, we have to know that we have a responsibility to connect with and to bind ourselves with every single Jewish person, even the simplest Jews. Because in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Dalet Minim, all four species have to be present. In exactly the same way as you could not fulfill this mitzvah if the lulav or the hadas or the esrog for sure was missing, you equally cannot fulfill the mitzvah if the arabas are missing or dried out or lost all of their leaves. So we need those simple yidden in the mix, otherwise we don't have a mix. In fact, they bring something to the table that the rest of us don't necessarily have. As we know in Chassidus, we talk about the fact that simplicity of people who are uneducated, who don't necessarily appreciate the complexity and sophistication of their Judaism. So they have this absolute simplicity, and that simplicity plugs right in to the unadulterated simplicity of Hashem's essence. So therefore, that illustrates to us that specifically when we connect to simple Jews, that links us to Hashem's simple truth, Hashem's simple essence. Simple not in the sense of unsophisticated, simple in the sense of it's a single unity. Which brings us to another lesson. That actually the way we connect with those more qualified members of the Jewish community will be fundamentally different to how we connect to those simpler members of the Jewish community. Those people in the community who are capable of learning Torah and doing deep, profound good deeds. Well, then they've got to be doing that because that's their skill set, that's what they're capable of. They have to live up to it. It doesn't matter, it's of no value for a person to say, I come from a long line of great rabbis. I have a family who are all scholars. It's not good enough to register for the yeshiva. It's not even good enough that a person learned Torah just a moment ago. That person, remember, in order for the lulav to be kosher, right now it has to be a lulav that comes from a date tree. In order for a Jew who is the Torah scholar to be kosher, right now the person has to be learning Torah. The person has to be learning Torah. And the exact same thing would apply to good deeds. Can't help that I'm resting on my laurels of the deeds that I did in the past, and I need to be doing good deeds now. But when we want to engage with and bring close that simple Jew, we are not supposed to first put forward a whole lot of restrictive clauses. First, you've got to learn Torah. First, you've got to do good deeds. And then we'll connect. In fact, we cannot even apply to this person the prerequisite that at least you have to feel Jewish, and only then I'll connect with you. Rather, we have to recognize Yisrael, because this is a person of Jewish heritage. Jewish heritage meaning that they're 100% Jewish. So therefore, that's the reason I have to connect to them. Mitzad Avas Yisrael, because I have a responsibility to love every single Jewish person. Mipnei Yehudi, because they're a Jewish person. And if there's a Jewish person who is completely desensitized to the fact that they are Jewish, the response from us should not be rejection or judgment. It should be even greater compassion and drawing them close. When you feel tremendous compassion or empathy for a person, that stimulates a tremendous love for that person. When we take the attitude of showing unmitigated, unadulterated love for our fellow Jew, that will bring them closer to Torah. It's not going to work the other way around. You need to step up to the plate and come closer to Torah, and then I'll love you. Eventually, through absolute love and non-judgmental approach, we will elevate that person and draw them close to Torah. We'll turn them into esroigim, meaning to say that they'll have not only a connection with Torah, but a deep understanding and connection, a deep investment in Torah, and the translation of that Torah into good deeds. This is, of course, coming from the perspective that we quoted right at the beginning, that kapos tmorim, if you don't have the requisite elements of the lulav, that it comes from a date producing palm, then you've got to reject it. Like the Rogatchover pointed out, right? The lulav has to come not just from a date palm, but a palm that produces dates. But there are other opinions. That actually, kapos tmorim is describing the species, not the practical production of fruit. In other words, you could take a lulav from a tree that is called a date palm, even if it's never seen dates in its life, in the same way as you could take an arava that's not from a river. According to this view, any date palm is kosher as a lulav, and you don't have to necessarily have fruit. So let's try and understand, now that we've got these two opinions, so now we're actually splitting it a little differently. We're saying hadassim and esrogim, according to all opinions, have to satisfy the specific requirements of the Torah. The esrog has to be beautiful. The hadassim have to have 3 leaves per node. Lulav, open to debate. Maybe it does have to be a date that produces fruits. Maybe it doesn't. And the arava, according to all opinions, does not actually have to grow next to a river as long as it belongs to that species. So what's the difference between them? It goes without saying, of course, that the mitzvah of lulav and esrog on Sukkot is one of the practical mitzvahs that we have to do. In fact, it's one of the most beautiful or elevated of all the practical mitzvahs that we do. Because think about the objective. It's about bringing all Jews together without any distinction in absolute unity. To create a unity between the Jewish people that is similar to the unity of the 4 letters of Hashem's name. Look at this amazing thing. How do you do this? And when we say how do you do this, meaning to say, if you don't get it right, the whole mitzvah doesn't work. The only way to get to the mitzvah, which is a practical mitzvah that you do, and a mitzvah that represents the unity of the whole Jewish people, is ironically by including people who don't do. And it's not just some kind of bring them along and we'll kind of cover for them. And as the Medrash says, the more versed members of the community will atone for the less schooled members of the community. It's more than that. Logically, the whole concept of bringing together Jewish people in connection to Hashem should be undone by having people in that crowd who are not doing what Hashem wants. In exactly the same way as the halacha says, you cannot have a person who is not Aaron HaKohen making the Parah Aduma. Why? Because en kateger nasa saneger. So not Aaron. The fact that the Parah Aduma couldn't be done by Aaron, it had to be done by Eliezer his son. Because en kateger nasa saneger, you can't have somebody who represents the opposite of what you're trying to achieve, achieving it. You can't have the person who was involved in the Egel Azov making a Parah Aduma. You can't have a person who's not involved at all in the Judaism, surely being part of creating the structure of Judaism. Therefore, we have to understand and appreciate that both the contribution of the Arava and even to an extent of the Lulav, at least from that opinion that the Lulav does not have to come from a tree that actually produces dates, what they are contributing is due to the essence of who they are. The fact that we are descendants of Avraham Avinu, who had this incredible spiritual power. What we're seeing, you don't determine the value of a Jewish person based on what they do, but based on who they are. And when you bring all the Jews together, that reveals who they are, even though they're not yet doing these things. So let's now link this back to the Lulav. It's very clear in the case of the Arava. The Arava does not have the deeds, and yet we're making a statement that the Arava has the essence. Let's link that back to the Lulav from the perspective that the Lulav perhaps is not from a tree that actually produces fruits. Truma nitenes rak lekohen ki hu mibonav shel Aaron HaKohen. We know that Truma can only go to a Kohen who is a direct descendant of Aaron HaKohen. V'af al pichein ratzinu shetzarich shetiyah b'malas haTorah. So, who gets Truma? Any Kohen. But who should get Truma? A Kohen who knows Torah. And it's considered a very bad thing to hand over Truma to a Kohen who isn't qualified in terms of Torah, who's what the Torah would call an Amoritz. Same principle over here. If you're looking from the action perspective, who should be here? A lulav that learns. A lulav is actually a Torah scholar. But once we're looking from the perspective of the essence of the Jew, which is exactly the mitzvah of the Dalet, the message of the mitzvah of the Dalet Minim, then even the person who hasn't actually learned Torah still is here because of the essence of who they are. And now we start to see that actually including the lulav that may not be from a date-producing palm into the 4 species may even be more surprising than having the arava. Why? A person who has Torah but doesn't translate that Torah into deeds, a knowledgeable person without deeds is far worse than an ignorant person without deeds. An ignorant person doesn't know what they're supposed to be doing, so you can't blame them for not doing. But a person who has knowledge, who is what we might qualify as a Talmud Chacham, and they're not applying it in deed, that's far more serious. And this is similar to the fact that the Chazal tell us that if a Talmud Chacham does something that you and I would be considered an inadvertent action, in their case it's actually considered a rebellion because they should know better. And that gives us another layer to this lesson of connecting to every single Jew. As the Medrash said, let them all be bound up in a single bind. It's not only that, some of us can get our heads around the fact, look, there are Jews on the periphery, and if we don't intervene, who knows what could happen. It's literally pikuach nefesh, spiritual danger to their lives. You've got to bring them on board. People who are completely ignorant, we have to educate. People who are assimilated, we have to draw them close. These are people who have never tasted Judaism, we've got to help them. But the lesson goes further than that. Even if there's a person who knows better. They went through the system and now they're not observant. Our responsibilities, we have to be dedicated to that individual and connect with that individual. We should all be bound together. Despite the fact that we may feel a sense of judgment or criticism towards them, you should know better. And if we don't bring that person through the door and we don't include them in our experience of Sukkot, we don't have an experience of Dalet Minim. And when we succeed in bringing together all the various elements of the Jewish community, not only the ones that are so easy and comfortable or knowledgeable or committed, then as the Medrash we already quoted before tells us, we atone for each other. Which doesn't just mean we get rid of whatever negative might be, but lechaper also means we generate a tremendous nachas for Hashem. And that is so powerful that, again, borrowing the words from the Medrash, it's as if the Eibush is elevated because of us. And that's going to bring Moshiach. Because we're actually told Mashiach is waiting for us to be a single bound unit. And then the Eibush can say Mashiach should happen, take it from Yad Mamash.